we're going to be reading from The Spirits of Christmas, The Darkside of the Holidays. Be back in a minute. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust, turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Hey everybody, welcome, TikTok, welcome everywhere else. My name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento, California. We are 45 strong up and down the state of California, which means if you think you have a paranormal need, we can get to you. It might take us a while, but we definitely can get to y'all. California is a huge state. Anyway, welcome everybody. Today is Sunday reading day. And I'm going to be reading from a paranormal-themed book. I've read from this book before during the holidays. It's an excellent book. Author Sylvia Shults is a good friend of mine, and she's been so kind as to let me read from this book. I will not be doing readings. Okay, no readings today. And hopefully one of my moderators in there, if you guys have any questions. I'm trying to get as many likes as we can, so please double tap that screen. And if you feel like gifting, please do so. Every little bit is appreciated. All right. So let's get on with this. I'm going to read for about an hour from The Spirits of Christmas, The Darkside of the Holidays. So here we go. We left off with the Indian Ocean tsunami. Thailand, in Southeast Asia, is a favorite vacation destination for people from all over the world. Thailand is known as the Land of Smiles for the legendary hospitality and politeness of its people. Buddhism is the major religion of the country, and Buddhist serenity seems ingrained in the people. Tourism companies describing a Thailand vacation promise something for everyone. Sophisticated metropolitan Bangkok has big city energy with markets and temples to explore. Northern Thailand is home to archaeological riches, including several World Heritage sites. Visitors can wander ancient temples and cities, peek at opulent royal palaces, and visit elephant camps in the majestic mountains to see the great beasts at work and at play. And in the south are Thailand's famous beach resorts. Tourists from across the world come to these luxury resorts to enjoy the pure white sand beaches and the tropical islands dotting the blue-green sea. But on December 26, 2004, this serene paradise became hell on earth. A massive undersea earthquake triggered a series of tsunamis that devastated Southeast Asia. The earthquake that caused the Indian Ocean tsunami was the third largest quake ever recorded, with an estimated magnitude of 9.1 on the Richter scale. It holds the record for the longest duration ever observed. The earthquake redistributed the continental shelf and changed the rotation of the Earth. The quake was so strong, it shortened the length of the Earth's day by about 2 microseconds. Think of an ice skater, pulling her arms in to tighten the speed at which she spins. All of this caused incredible destruction. Waves 100 feet high slammed into the Indian Ocean. Its Indian coast, killing 230,000 people in 14 countries. 50,000 people were missing after the tsunami struck. They were later added to the list of presumed dead, bringing the toll to an estimated 280,000. It was the 5th deadliest natural disaster in history. This devastating tragedy led to many hauntings along Thailand's lovely beaches. They began almost immediately after the waves receded. A security guard quit his job after hearing After hearing the screams of a woman echoing in the night from the wreckage of a hotel that was particularly badly hit. ABC Australia Broadcasting Company reported that spook volunteers searching for bodies at the resort areas of Phi Island and I'll try this. Khao Lak heard tourists singing and laughing on the beach. When they went to investigate, they found only darkness and empty sand. In Khao Lak, A local family's telephone rang constantly in the days and nights following the tsunami. When they answered the phone, they could hear the voices of friends and relatives begging to be rescued from the flames of the crematorium. Many of these ghosts are foreigners. There's the story of a ghostly tourist who wanders up and down one of those beautiful beaches, calling mournfully for her lost child. Another tale tells of a foreign man and his Thai girlfriend who hailed a cab to take them to the airport, but disappeared during the ride. That was not the only report of vanishing passengers. The BBC aired an anecdote told by a tuk-tuk driver who gave his name only as Lek. On January 6, 2005, 7 foreign tourists climbed into his minivan late at night. After agreeing on a 200 baht fee, the tourists asked Lek to drive them to Kata Beach on the west coast of the island. Phuket. Okay, I didn't say a bad word. Okay, Phuket. He drove for a while, and then suddenly he felt his body go curiously numb. He glanced in his rearview mirror, and all 7 of his passengers were gone. Many Thais are deeply superstitious. In addition to Buddhism, there's a certain degree of nature worship going on too. Many Thais believe most large trees are home to ghosts, and every home has a spirit house or altar where offerings of food and drink are made daily to pacify any supernatural entities who may be nearby. Fish sellers and seafood restaurants along the west coast saw a drop in business from the locals after the tsunami. Many Thais were refusing to eat fish, fearing that ocean creatures had been nibbling on human corpses that had been swept out to sea. Almost 95% of Thailand's population is Buddhist, and they believe in reincarnation, regardless of religion. Each time a person dies, their spirit spends some unspecified amount of time as a ghost, self-aware and seeking rebirth. Buddhist monks chant prayers to the dead, urging them to stop wandering to places where they died, so the living can be left in peace and the dead can be reborn. An interesting facet of these ghost stories is that nearly all the ghosts roaming Thailand's beaches and resorts after the tsunami were foreign, and Asians were utterly terrified of them. In the years after the disaster, tourism from Europe, Australia, and the United States rebounded pretty quickly, but the number of tourists coming to Thailand from Asia plummeted. Psychologist Wanlup Piyamayutham, I'm trying to explain this in an interview with BBC News. Foreigners make a big impression on the Thais, the doctor said. They're physically imposing and often seem rich and powerful. If people like that die in terrible circumstances, it's not surprising that they should come back in people's minds as ghosts, especially when they have so far to get home. The Buddhist monks of Thailand have figured out a way to help these lost foreign souls move on to their next life. In addition to burning offerings of paper clothes and symbolic money to appropriate these spirits, the monks added another offering, one that was sure to appeal to foreign tourists trapped in a strange land: pizza. Now, wouldn't that make you feel better? 'Tis the season, creeping up on Christmas. It's just as easy to find ghosts in December as it is any other month of the year. They're always out there, waiting for us to notice them. A flash flood. The middle years of the 19th century were a time of great social advances and great optimism. Social reforms were the order of the day, and many people felt they could change the world for the better through their ideas. It was not only in New England, cradle of the young nation, that these changes were taking place. Even in the Midwest, at that time, still considered the wild frontier, social reformers sought to spread their ideas. Judge Wade, Loughborough, purchased over 1,000 acres of land bordering on the Ohio River in Claremont County, and in 1844, he founded a village he called simply Utopia. Loughborough and his followers were supporters of the philosophy of a Frenchman named Charles Fourier. Fourier envisioned a society based on agriculture, far removed from the evils of the mechanization, where people would live and work together. Work would be assigned to people according to their natural inclinations and abilities. In short, he envisioned a commune, where every person's needs would be provided for, and where people would help one another. Loughborough and his group were eager to try out this social experiment for themselves. They built a 2-story brick building with 30 rooms for everyone to live in. Unfortunately, communal living is not always the easiest way to run a society, and within 2 years, it became obvious that the community was not going to be a viable option. In 1846, Loughborough, seeking a way to make at least some of his investment back, sold the land and house to John O. Waters, the leader of a group of 100 spiritualists. The spiritualists, too, were seeking a better way to a perfect society. Spiritualism was intensely popular during the mid-19th century, gaining even more followers during and after the Civil War. Spiritualists believed that human beings don't really die. Although physical bodies might decay, the spirit lives on in the afterlife. Spiritualists sought to communicate with the shades of the deceased with the help of mediums. The souls of the dead, they believed, could speak with those they left behind through many avenues, such as manifestations, written messages, spirit photography, trance speaking, automatic writing, even music. Waddles was a medium, blessed with the ability to converse with the spirits. He was not, however, a builder. When the spiritualists bought the house that Loughborough's group had built, they decided, for some reason, not to leave it where it was. Instead, they moved it closer to the river, adding a basement and a third story. The housewarming party for the reconstructed building and the spiritualist grand experiment was planned for December 13th, 1843. The house was filled with people, all gathered to mark the beginning of a new adventure. For most of the partygoers, though, it was not the beginning, but the end. As people mingled and chatted, sipping cups of punch, no one suspected the insidious danger that stalked the new building, drawing ever closer. Eventually, though, someone noticed that water was trickling across the floor in a slow but steady stream. Suddenly, the trickle became a torrent. Water from the Ohio River pushed its unstoppable way through the house, flooding everything in its path. It has been said that only 6 people survived the calamity. The house is still home to several spirits, according to reports going back to the early 20th century. The spirits, including a lady in a blue dress and bonnet, always appear soaking wet. Families have lived in the Waddles house since 1917. A second-floor bedroom is believed to have been John Waddles' room, as many people report having a peculiar experience there. People say they feel an unnatural sense of drowsiness there, almost like a trance state. In this twilight doze, people say they experienced a vision of 6 travelers coming up a dirt road, entering the Waddles house, and walking up the staircase to the bedroom. As they come closer to the room, the vision fades away. The woman in blue is invariably a part of the group in the vision. Witnesses sometimes see her accompanied by a young boy and a man in Amish-style clothing. If this bedroom was once indeed used by John Waddles, these witnesses might be experiencing a hint of the trance state used by that long-ago spiritualist when he communicated with phantoms in his own time. Richard Crawford, a historian and writer who has made the study of the Waddles house his passion, described an odd experience he had at the house. He was there with a film crew to shoot an annual Halloween show. The owner's daughter, says Crawford, who couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old, just started jumping up and down, saying she wanted to be on television. Understandable behavior for an excitable little kid. The girl's mother shushed her, telling her she had to stay out of the way and leave the film crew alone while they were working. Of course, you can tell a kid 100 times to stay out from underfoot, but making sure she does it is another thing entirely. Filming was delayed several times because of the girl's interruptions. The mother insisted that the crew keep quiet about the ghost stories associated with the home. She didn't want her kid freaked out by the thought of ghosts. Finally, the crew was finished shooting and ready to wrap. They were in John Waddles' bedroom when the door burst open and the little girl came barreling into the room yet again. The mother, exasperated, asked the girl what she wanted. Crawford says that the girl asked her mother if she remembered what had happened just a couple of nights earlier. The mother recalled aloud that she had been baking and had asked the girl to stop bothering her. I'm beginning to see a pattern here. This is the writer. The girl nodded in agreement and, according to Crawford's recollection, said, "Yes, and I didn't bug you anymore. I didn't even let the people who came to the door into the house. There were 6 people outside, and there was a lady in a blue dress with a blue bonnet, and they were all wet. Mother and film crew sat stunned. The girl's mother had been vigilant about shielding her young daughter from the unsettling stories of the house's history, but all on her own. The girl had just described the apparitions people have been seeing for years, down to the smallest detail. They say children are more receptive to seeing spirits simply because they haven't yet learned that they can't. It seems the little girl was picking up on the psychic echo of that long ago tragedy. The Haunting of Hunley House. The morning of December 12, 1928, dawned bright and brisk in Carbondale, Illinois. Before midnight that evening, the town would be rocked with news of a horrific double murder. One of the victims was John Charles Hunley, who had been mayor of Carbondale in 1907 to 1908. He was a wealthy, well-respected businessman who had many friends and business associates in the area. Also dead was Hunley's second wife, Luella. Although he had the respect of his peers, Mr. Hunley had made some mistakes in his life. In 1893, he had unalived a man. Hunley had unalived a music teacher, but was acquitted by the jury after he explained his reason. The man had been sleeping with his wife. By invoking the unwritten law, Hunley gained the sympathy of the husbands and brothers sitting in the jury box. After this incident, Hunley divorced his unfaithful wife. This caused a family rift between Hunley and his son, Victor. The spat has supposedly been smoothed over years before John's murder. But there were those in town who hadn't forgotten the bitter feelings between father and son. Hunley remarried a few years after his divorce, choosing Luella Harrison as his new bride. That was confusing, right? Or did I miss that? Luella herself came from a business-minded family. Her father was Ruffin Harrison, one of the founders of the town of Herrin, Illinois, and the owner of numerous coal mines in the region. And she was sister to George Harrison. No, not that George Harrison, president of Herrin's First National Bank. In 1915, John and Luella Hunley bought a lot at the corner of Main and Maple Streets and built a lavish, luxurious home for themselves. John was the model of a Gilded Age tycoon, partnering with his son Victor Icy in the younger Hunley's coal business. Luella, as befitting the wife of an upper-class businessman, was very active in charity work and was an accomplished musician besides. Luella, in particular, was regarded as having no enemies, which made her murder even more shocking. A family friend, Joab Goodall, visited the Hunleys on the evening of Wednesday, December 12th. The Hunleys were planning a motor trip to their winter home in Florida, and they were looking forward with high spirits to their departure on Sunday. Goodall left the house around 8 p.m., and Luella locked the back door behind him. Just before midnight, Olga Casper, the Hunleys' next-door neighbor, heard several pistol shots ring out into the night. Peering out her window, she saw the lights of the Hunley house go out. Later, she heard someone running past her house, coming from the Hunleys' home and heading towards Victor's house, just 200 yards away. In response to phone calls from the neighbors, police were on the scene in minutes. The investigation determined that John Hunley was unalived first. His body was found in an upstairs bedroom, dressed only in a nightshirt and socks. He had been shot from behind, 6 times with a .45 caliber revolver. Luella Hunley had been killed, it seemed, on a rear stairway, attacked, as she went to investigate the earlier shots. She had been shot twice in the head and once in the heart. From the stairs, her body had rolled into the kitchen. A pencil lay on the floor next to her left hand, and an unfinished letter was still sitting on the table in the next room. Luella's was a life suddenly interrupted. At first, Chief of Police Joe Montgomery told the press that robbery seemed to be the motive for the murders. However, there was only the slimmest evidence for this theory: an empty pocketbook on the floor near Luella's body. Other than that, nothing in the house was disturbed. Not the valuable artwork, not the expensive furnishings, and not the considerable amount of cash. The police quickly focused on their investigation elsewhere. On the morning of December 13th, investigators thoroughly searched the Hunley house. They discovered that the back door that Joab Goodall said Luella had locked behind him after his visit was unlocked at the time of the murders, with no sign, a forced entry. That hinted strongly that the Hunleys knew their attacker. Perhaps Luella even got up from her letter writing to let him into the house. Tracking dogs were brought in and put on the trail of the killer. 4 times the dogs led their handlers straight to the home of Victor Hunley, John's son. This didn't look good for Victor. Even worse, investigators from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office searched the route between the 2 houses. Along the path, the investigators located several slips of paper that seemed to have been dropped unnoticed, perhaps as the killer fled from the house. One paper, dated December 5th, was a notice of termination of partnership of Mr. and Mrs. J.C. Hunley with Victor Hunley, dissolving their support of Victor's prominent coal business. Another paper was a bank deposit slip. On the back of a note in Luella's handwriting figured the interest on a loan in the amount of $532. At the top of the slip, also in Luella's handwriting, was the name Vic. All this was enough for Sheriff William Flanagan to bring Victor Hunley in for questioning. Things began to look even bleaker for young Victor when investigators found a blood-stained khaki shirt during their search of his house. Victor claimed he'd been wearing the shirt when he'd been told of his father's and stepmother's murders. Police had come to the door, Victor said, and had woken him and asked him to come to the elder Hunley's house. He had picked up his stepmother's body while he was there and wearing the shirt, and that's where the blood had come from. Investigators countered with the fact that Victor hadn't touched the body. Victor immediately changed his story. He remembered suddenly that he'd been wearing the shirt while out hunting quail, and that's where the blood had come from. Sheriff Flanagan hammered on Victor for 7 hours. Victor told investigators that on Wednesday night, the night of the murders, he'd been home all evening reading and playing with his son. He had gone to bed early. Then he'd been awakened by the police. He admitted that he owned a .45 caliber revolver, but he claimed that he had recently loaned it to his father. Police searched both houses for the gun, but found nothing. To this day, the murder weapon has never been found. All of Victor's protests did not prove his innocence. He was put under house arrest as the investigation continued. At the inquest, Joab Goodall testified that John Hunley had recently told him that he planned to write up a new will. John planned to disinherit Victor because he was no good. If this was the case, Victor stood to lose a lot of money, but by being cut out of his father's will. John Hunley's estate was worth over $350,000, but Victor was faced with having to settle just for his trust fund, worth less than $15,000. Victor was arrested for the murders of John Charles and Luella Hunley on December 15th, immediately after their funerals. The state's attorney, Fletcher Lewis, felt sure he could prove Victor guilty in court. Incredibly, though, Lewis was wrong. In an amazing display of the accused being innocent until proven guilty, Lewis was forced to let Victor go free on December 31st. After the hearing, the disappointed prosecutor made a statement to the press. While the facts and circumstances learned from the investigation amply justified the holding of Victor Hunley and the filing of a complaint charging him with murder, I have decided to prosecute the case no further. As if washing down this bitter pill, Lewis added, I feel quite sure that the atrociousness of this crime will compel the conscience of the person who committed it to someday make public his guilt. But if Lewis thought to shame Victor or anyone else into confessing to the double murder, it didn't work. The shooting of J.C. and Luella Hunley has never been solved. Maybe that's why the house in which they died still echoes with their presence. The mansion sat empty for 2 years after the murders. The only physical evidence of the tragedy was a bullet hole in the wall near where Luella's body was found. But the community's memory was long, especially when it came to murder. In 1930, Edwin Volger Sr. bought the mansion and its contents from the Hunley estate. And in 1972, the house was sold to the Simons family, who converted the mansion into a gift shop with apartments upstairs. Several of the past owners and tenants have reported oddities in the building. One resident heard the piano downstairs playing faintly by itself. Her family also heard footsteps going up and down the stairs. Former owner Victoria Spray felt that Luella's ghost followed her home from work at least once. Spray ran the gift shop in the Hunley house for 5 years. One evening, as she let herself into her empty house, she noticed that the kitchen lights were on, and she heard pots and pans clanging. She wasn't spooked by the sounds, though it's a very peaceful vibe, she said. Spray's daughter Nina had her own odd experience with the ghost of the Hunley house. She and her husband have both seen the porch swing move by itself, even when there's no wind. I think Mr. and Mrs. Hunley still like to swing at night, she said. The Messenger of Donner Pass. A trucker named Mark L. shared an eerie experience he had that stretched out over 2 Christmas seasons. In late autumn of 1996, Mark's father had gone to a friend's house for a visit. As soon as he walked into the house, he clutched his chest, dropped to the floor, and died of a massive heart attack. The police called Mark and asked him to go take care of his mother. Mark rushed to his mother's side and made all the necessary phone calls. As evening faded into night, family began to gather at the house. Mark needed to go out for cigarettes, so, knowing his mother now had the comfort of family around her, he left the house for a quick trip to the gas station. As he pulled into the gas station parking lot, Mark said he just had the strange feeling that his father's soul just wasn't where it should be. He couldn't explain the feeling, even to himself. Mark got out of the car and started to walk to the convenience store. "Spare some change, mister? Could I maybe wash your windshield for you?" The bum looked harmless enough, but Mark wasn't in the mood for much interaction. Instead, he pulled out a $5 bill, gave it to the guy, and asked him to pray for his dad. The bum happily took the $5 and started praying, loudly. Just to make sure things were copacetic, Mark gave the guy a good hard look. It was then that he noticed the bum's eyes were a penetrating shade of blue, so piercing blue they could stop you in your tracks. Mark thanked the guy for his prayers and asked him his name. The bum replied, "I'm Irish." Shaking his head, Mark went into the convenience store, bought his cigarettes, and headed home. Several months passed. The encounter with the bum stuck in Mark's mind, and every time he went to that gas station, he kept an eye out for the guy. A few years later, Mark saw the man again. Mark asked the guy if he remembered him, and if his name was Irish. "Yeah, I'm Irish, but, nah, I don't remember you." Mark realized with a jolt that the guy's eyes were brown so deep they were almost black. They were not the startling blue Mark had seen the night his father had passed away. But that was only part of Mark's story. Much of Mark's driving took place on I-80 in all kinds of weather. Mark grew up in California, so he didn't have much experience with driving in snow and ice. I'm sorry. Yeah, so he didn't have much experience with driving in snow and ice. Once, though, he was teamed with another driver who managed to jackknife the truck during a blizzard in Kansas. After that, Mark had a healthy respect for driving in winter conditions. Christmas was fast approaching, and Mark was doing short hops from Chicago to California, making his way home for Christmas. On December 23rd, he pulled into the Alamo truck stop for a break. Donner Pass was before him. Mark was toying with the idea of trying to get a little sleep before tackling the pass, but he was so exhausted he knew an hour nap might turn into 8 hours of solid sleep. A storm was blowing in, and Mark still wasn't sure what his next move should be. He climbed down from the cab of his truck and headed in to use the restroom. Mark was walking about 10 feet behind a group of other drivers when one of them turned around and spoke to him. "If you're trying to get home, you better go over the pass right now." Mark didn't know this guy and had never talked to him, but the man had the same brilliant blue eyes Mark had seen the night his father had died. Mark turned on his heel and went straight back to his truck. He gunned the engine and headed up Donner Pass. The CB crackled with incoming weather reports as Mark drove. He made it all the way through the pass and stopped at a rest area when he was safely through the mountains. As Mark pulled out of that rest area, the snow was falling thickly, and he heard over the radio that Donner Pass had been shut down, and it stayed closed for a day and a half. He had made it through the pass just in time. If Mark hadn't followed that unknown trucker's advice, he'd have been stuck at the truck stop over Christmas. As it was, he made it safely home to Los Angeles after delivering his final load. My mother had a smile for the first time on Christmas since my father had passed away that Christmas before. Mark has never seen anyone with blue eyes quite like that again, but he is always on the lookout for them. To this day, if I see piercing blue eyes like that, I listen to the words being spoken. Okay. Next story is House of Plenty. Double tap that screen. Let's get those fingers walking. Let them fingers do the walking. Madison County, Illinois, is in the southern part of the state is a quiet rural area. In 1879, Timothy Grouse built a home for himself in the town of Highland. 100 years later, in the early 1980s, Ken and Judy Ernst rented part of the house for use as a small bakery. Within a decade, Judy's baked goods business had become so popular, the couple bought the entire house. For a while, they lived in the house and ran a small restaurant and business. But by the end of the 80s, the restaurant had grown to fill the entire building, and the couple made their home elsewhere. The House of Plenty restaurant is thought to be haunted by the spirit of the original owner, Timothy Grouse. The story goes that Grouse hosted a party in his home in honor of the town's early Swiss settlers who were planning a trip back to Switzerland to visit their families. The plans for a joyful reunion turned to tragedy, though. The ship carrying the travelers sank, claiming the lives of over 300 passengers. According to Chad Lewis, writing in the Illinois Road Guide to Haunted Locations, some people believe that after losing so many of his friends in the sinking, Timothy Grouse continues to wait for their return. Grouse. The restaurant building is notorious for having things mysteriously go missing. One day, Judy Ernst was in the kitchen baking an angel food cake. She left it on the counter to cool. Several hours later, she came back to find that the cake had vanished. Neither the cake nor the pan was ever found. Well, you might be thinking to yourself, a missing cake, that's not so bad. Someone left an angel food cake unattended in my kitchen for several hours. Of course, it would be gone. But try this, went on for size. Someone who had once lived in the home stopped by for a visit. She asked Judy if she'd ever had anything go missing, and Judy mentioned the story of the cake and the pan. As she spoke, the visitor's face blanched a ghostly white. Then the visitor shared a story of her own. Years before, her mother had been boiling potatoes on the stove in that same kitchen. Her husband had come home, and Mama went into the living room to greet him. She gave him a quick kiss, then came immediately back to the kitchen to check on the food. The mother was stunned to discover on her return that the pot of boiling potatoes had vanished into thin air. The dining room of the restaurant is the scene of a strange phenomenon that happens every Christmas. There was a fireplace in the dining room with several tables for guest dining arranged near the hearth. Every year around Christmas, Ken Ernst would notice a small pile of charred pipe tobacco on the corner of one of the tables. How it got there was a mystery, until a former occupant of the home brought in an old photograph of the Grouse family, the home's original owners. Standing in the photograph was a young man who was smoking a pipe. He was identified as Grouse's son, and it's believed that he liked to spend his winter evenings in that very room smoking a pipe while sitting next to the fireplace. The House of Plenty is now closed, and the good smells of home-cooked food no longer fill the air. However, as Christmas approaches, maybe the scent of good pipe tobacco still lingers in the dining room, and Timothy Grouse's pipe loving son still knocks his spent ash onto a handy table near the fireplace. Okay. Haunted boats. USS Constellation. After America won independence from England, the new young nation had miles upon miles of coastline to protect. Ships were built from America's first Navy. One of these was the USS Constellation, 175 feet long, with 3 main masts. She was launched at Harris Creek, Maryland, on September 7, 1796, as a 36-gun frigate. Her first captain was Thomas Truxton, and he started the ship's bloody career with a bang, quite literally. On February 5, 1799, the Constellation got into a battle with the French frigate La Insurgente in the West Indies. The French ship was captured, but in the heat and terror of battle, a sailor named Neil Harvey deserted his post. Truxton found out and ordered a Lieutenant Sterrett to run Harvey through with his sword. After the battle, Harvey, wounded but still alive, was tied to the end of a cannon and blown to pieces. On Truxton's orders, as a warning to the other sailors not to slack off on duty. Not surprisingly, Harvey's ghost is one of the most frequently seen on the ship. He's even been mistaken for a costume tour guide. The Constellation saw many missions throughout her long service to the United States Navy. She provided support for land troops fighting Seminole Indians and distinguished herself in the War of 1812. She tussled with slave traders and Barbary pirates, and sailed as far as West Africa, China, and Hawaii. In 1845, the ship sailed to the Navy Yard at Norfolk, Virginia, for a complete overhaul. She had been given a new stern in 1829 to 1830, and the hull of a wooden ship needed to be rebuilt every 16 years or so anyway. We don't know how much of the original ship's material was left after that 1845 to 1855 rebuild, but it was enough to keep the ghosts hanging around. The Constellation's rebuild was finished in 1855. The ship was downgraded from a 36-gun frigate to a 22-gun sloop. The Constellation was the last ship of the United States Navy to be powered completely by sail. The Navy was moving towards steam power. In 1893, the ship docked at the naval station at Newport, Rhode Island, and served as a stationary training ship until 1914. Then it sat neglected for decades. In 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt recommissioned her as the flagship of the United States Atlantic Fleet. When the money for that project dried up, the ship was towed to Boston. In 1953, a group of historically minded Maryland citizens raised funds to bring the Constellation home to Baltimore. By September 1955, the ship had come to her final home, and that's when the ghost stories began. Several ships, including the submarine Pike, were moored nearby. Their sailors told tales of strangeness on the Constellation, odd noises, spook lights, ghostly shapes, and misty figures walking on her decks. By December 1955, Lieutenant Commander Alan Ross Brougham had heard many of the stories. He decided the situation warranted an investigation. He called up a friend of his who was a photographer and invited him to bring his camera aboard. They set up the camera facing the ship's wheel. Then they waited. At exactly 11:59:47 p.m. on that cold December night, Brahms smelled the faint odor of something like gunpowder. Immediately after that, he saw the translucent bluish-white phantom of a 19th century U.S. Navy captain. The phantasm wore gold epaulets and a cocked hat, and was slightly bent at the waist, reaching down with its right hand as if to draw a sword. At the click of the camera shutter, the ghost vanished, but Brom had his picture. Many witnesses to the spirits of the ship report smelling gunpowder in the air just before the apparitions manifest. Captain Truxton especially announces his impending presence with the acrid tang of gunpowder. And all the Constellation spirits seem to be most active around midnight, especially in the week between Christmas and New Year's Day. There are several ghosts on board to keep Captain Truxton and Neil Harvey company. An 11-year-old boy served on the ship from 1820 to 1822 as a surgeon's assistant. In 1822, he was cornered by two sailors on the orlop deck and stabbed to death. No one knows why. Another sailor, overwhelmed by the harsh life at sea, unalived himself. Then there's the spirit of Carl Hansen, a night watchman who worked on the Constellation in the mid-20th century until an alarm system was installed in 1963. Hansen is the only spirit on the ship who didn't die a violent death, and is believed to haunt the ship because he actually is happy to be there. His ghost has been seen enjoying a game of cards on the lower decks. In 1964, a Catholic priest came aboard for a tour. No one from the Maryland Naval Militia was around at the time, so he went below decks on his own. He was met by a guide who seemed very knowledgeable about the inner workings and terminology of the ship. After the informative tour, the priest thanked the guide and headed for the exit. As he was leaving the ship, he ran into the other guides. He complimented them on finding such an enthusiastic volunteer. The guides exchanged nervous glances. "There's no one below right now," one said. The men all rushed down to find the intruder, but there was no one there. The Constellation, at rest now in Baltimore Harbor, is a prized artifact of American history. And apparently, some of her crew are still celebrating the holidays late at night, walking the decks of this grand ship. All right. I like stories like that. Love those kind of stories. Lord Combermere returns. The second Lord Combermere had a favorite chair in the library in his grand estate, Combermere Abbey. He was so fond of the spot that he was photographed sitting comfortably in that chair, while his funeral was being held 4 miles away. There were two viscounts that held the title of Lord Combermere in the 19th century. The first viscount was a cavalry commander in the early 1800s. In 1817, he was appointed governor of Barbados. It was this Lord Cumbersome, did I say it right? Combermere, I'm sorry, Cumbersome, that has a curious connection to the supernatural. He was governor at the time that moving coffins were causing great consternation for the Chase family. The Chase family vault was a beautiful crypt in the burying ground at Christchurch Parish in Barbados, made of coral, carved stone, and concrete walls 2 feet thick. It was sealed with a massive slab of blue marble. The vault was impenetrable. Couldn't be penetrated. That's why it was such a shock to find that the coffins that had been placed reverently in the tomb were found to have been rearranged with violent force. Whenever the vault was opened for another burial, the coffins of the Chase family members were found thrown haphazardly around the vault, instead of remaining where they'd been placed and replaced with tender care. Lord Combermere, the governor, had heard the unsettling stories and decided to put a stop to the nonsense. He ordered the vault opened. He had slaves sprinkle sand on the floor to capture the footprints of any intruders, human or animal. Then, when the vault was closed, he pressed his governor's seal into the fresh cement. 2 years later, he returned to inspect the vault. The outside of the tomb was as rock solid as ever, but inside, all was chaos. The 6 coffins had been tossed about like toys, and the sand on the floor was completely undisturbed. The second Viscount, born in 1818, went by the splendid name of Wellington Henry Stapleton Cotton. In 1891, when this gentleman was visiting London, he was run over by a carriage and suffered injuries to both legs. The sturdy 73-year-old recovered well, and 6 weeks later he was able to get around with the aid of crutches. But a blood clot developed in his heart, and on December 1st, 1891, he dropped dead. The Lord's funeral was held on Sunday, December 5th, at St. Margaret's in the town of Wrenbury, 4 miles from the family estate. Many prominent persons attended the funeral, so the time of services was held back a bit, to give the honored mourners ample time to arrive. The services began at 2 in the afternoon. It just so happened that a photographer, Sybil R. Corbett, had been engaged to take pictures of the family estate. Lord Combermere's funeral, while unfortunate, was scheduled at the same time. Since most of the household would be away at the church, Corbett set up an hour-long exposure in the library, confident that no one would wander in and disturb the ongoing photography project. Other projects came along, and Corbett didn't develop the plates she'd taken at the Combermere Abbey until August of the next year, 8 months after she'd exposed them. To her astonishment, the photograph she took in the library showed a white, translucent figure in the left side of the picture, sitting in Lord Combermere's favorite chair. The apparition wasn't complete. There was a head sitting atop a clearly defined collar, a shoulder, and a right arm ending in a hand that rested lightly on the arm of the chair. Sybil Corbett checked her diary. Sure enough, the photograph had been taken on December 5th, the day of Lord Combermere's funeral. She did some further investigating with the family and realized that the exposure had been made at 2 p.m. at the same time the delayed funeral was being conducted. Skeptics argued that perhaps a servant had come into the library during the hour-long exposure, sat in the Lord's chair just long enough to register on the photographic plate, then gotten up and left. But the family had agreed that the timing for the photography was, sadly, ideal, as most of the family and staff of the household would be at the church for the funeral. Besides, the ghostly figure in the picture seemed to have a bald head and a light beard. According to Corbett's diary, the only men in the house at the time were her brother, the butler, and 2 footmen. All 4 men were young and beardless. So it would seem that Lord Combermere returned to his library for one last rest in his favorite armchair before going on to an even more final rest. The Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. Another startling ghost photograph comes from another stately English home, Raynham Hall in Norfolk. This one might be just the most famous ghost photograph of all time. Raynham Hall was once the home of Lady Dorothy Townshend, who married Viscount Charles Townshend in 1713. As in many ghost stories, all was not peaceful country life at the Hall. Lady Townshend died on March 29, 1726, at the age of 40, under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was smallpox. However, there were rumors that her ladyship had been pushed down the grand staircase and the fall had broken her neck. During the Christmas season of 1835, a Colonel Loftus stayed at Raynham Hall as a guest. His stay was interrupted by a nighttime visitation from a beautiful woman. The colonel described her as a noble-looking lady, who was wearing a fashionable dress of brown satin. Her regal looks were spoiled, though, by the terrifying fact that she had no eyes. Only empty sockets gaped where her eyes should have been. Colonel Loftus made a sketch of his midnight visitor, and a portrait was painted from the sketch and hung in the guest bedroom where the brown lady made most of her appearances. Decades earlier, in 1786, the future King George the IV, I don't do letters, was a guest at the Hall and stayed in that particular room. The brown lady's appearance sent the Prince Regent shrieking into the hallway in his nightshirt, a rather embarrassing situation for royalty. After that, he swore he would never set foot in Raynham Hall again, a promise he kept for the rest of his days. The brown lady continued her haunting of the Hall well into the 20th century. On September 19, 1936, 2 photographers from the magazine Country Life were on assignment, taking pictures of the stately hall. Indra Shira was snapping the photos, accompanied by art director Captain Hubert Provand. Shira and Provand were setting up a shot of the grand main staircase of the house at around 4 p.m. when Shira saw an ethereal veiled form coming slowly down the stairs. Provand didn't see a thing. He even bet Shira £5 that nothing weird would show up when the picture was developed. He lost the bet. The brown lady had exchanged her customary brown satin dress for a filmy white veil, but her form showed up distinctly in the picture. One of the most famous ghost photographs in the world ran for the first time in Country Life magazine. Appropriately enough, it ran in that year's December issue. Okay. The Ghost of Anne Boleyn. The Tower of London comes by its ghostly reputation. Honestly. But by William the Conqueror in 1078, it has stood as a symbol of the might of England for nearly 1,000 years. It was originally a royal palace as well as a defensive fortress. In fact, Her Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress, the Tower of London, to use its proper name, is still officially a residence of the monarch. The Queen has a house on site called the Queen's House. If the ruler is male, of course it becomes the King's House. The kings and queens of England realized quite soon after its construction that the tower was just as good at keeping people in as it was at keeping people out. So it's been used as a prison since the year 1100, when Ranulph Flambard was imprisoned within the tower by Henry I. Flambard was also, by the way, the first person to escape from the tower. There have been many prisoners, royal, noble, and otherwise, who have met their ends either on the tower grounds or on nearby Tower Hill. Only 7 people were executed within the tower before the 20th century. One of these unfortunates was Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, who was beheaded for treason in 1536. Her ghost is said to haunt the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she is buried, but she is also known to roam the grounds of the White Tower while carrying her own severed head. Anne Boleyn is arguably the most famous ghost who wanders the tower, due to her ill-fated relationship with Henry VIII. Queen Anne even almost got one poor sentry court-martialed. The guard was found unconscious at his post outside the king's house one winter morning in 1864. He was accused of falling asleep while on duty and put on trial. At the hearing, though, the sentry had a really good explanation for his unconscious state. He had been standing guard when a white figure came towards him out of the early morning mist. The sentry challenged the figure 3 times, but the silent figure never answered. It just kept walking slowly towards him. Alarmed, the sentry lunged at the figure with his bayonet fixed, intending to run it through, whatever it was. But a flash of fire raced up the rifle barrel and knocked the sentry out cold. Luckily, other guards, including officers, came forward to testify at the hearing. They said they had seen the apparition too, from a window in the Bloody Tower. After some discussion, members of the court realized that the phantasm had been seen by multiple witnesses, just below the room where Anne had spent her last night alive, the night before her execution of May 19, 1536. The sentry was cleared. As for the doomed queen, she still wanders the tower, with her head tucked underneath her arm, as far as anyone knows. The Eileen Moore Lighthouse. Lighthouse keepers are a sturdy bunch. They're dedicated to the demanding job of keeping their lights burning to guide sailors safely to land. In fact, there is only one case on record of lighthouse keepers abandoning their post. The Eileen Moore Lighthouse was built on a rocky island off the west coast of Scotland. It was a remote and forbidding place, even for a lonely lighthouse. That made the Eileen Moore Light even more vital to the safety of those waters. The locals who lived on nearby islands believed that particular island was haunted. Only fools, they said, stayed on the island overnight. But the 3 men who had signed on as lighthouse keepers, of course, had no choice. That was their job, to stay on the island and tend to the Eileen Moore Light. What happened to those men is still unknown. On the night of December 15, 1900, the brigantine Fair Wind was making her way through the seas near the Eileen Moore Lighthouse. Sailors on deck saw a lifeboat in the water. At first they thought the boat was adrift, carrying corpses from a shipwreck. The bodies in the boat were pale, dressed in rags, but they were moving. The sailors on the Fair Wind could see that the men in the lifeboat were rowing and that they were heading for the lighthouse. The tiny craft with its ghastly cargo soon disappeared into the blackness. Later that same night, a storm whipped up. Sailors on the Fair Wind and other ships noticed that the Eileen Moore Light was out. The ship's captains were furious at the oversight. Luckily, no boats were wrecked in the stormy darkness. Days passed, and the lighthouse remained eerily dark. The sailors on passing ships began to be concerned. Something was definitely wrong. There were 3 men on the island. If one of them, or even 2, had been taken ill, there still should have been a man left to restart the light. At the very least, they should have been able to send some sort of distress signal ashore. But the island stayed stubbornly shrouded in darkness. A supply ship finally made it out to the island to investigate on the day after Christmas. They found no sign of any of the 3 men, and absolutely no clues as to where they had gone. The searchers found 2 strange things worth noting. The foul weather gear among the lighthouse supplies, the oilskin coats and heavy rubber boots, was all gone. The investigators also found shreds of seaweed scattered around. Not so unusual on an island, except that it was of a kind unknown in that area. The searchers did find the lighthouse logbook. That provided no clues, but only deepened the mystery. The head keeper, Thomas Marshall, wrote that a vicious storm had pummeled the lighthouse for 3 days, beginning December 12th. The log noted that the men spent those 3 days in a state of near panic, praying for their lives and crying. Strange behavior for stalwart lighthouse tenders. Had the desolation of their post made all 3 of the men snap? All at the same time? The final entry in the log was dated December 15th. Marshall wrote only this: "Storm is ended, sea calm, God is over all." But here's the creepy part. Besides the fact that the 3 men vanished. On the 3 days mentioned in the log, December 12th through December 15th, there was no storm. As a matter of fact, on the island of Lewis, just 20 miles away, The weather for those 3 days had been unusually calm. A storm had blown into the area on the night of December 15th. The day Marshall wrote that the seas were finally calm. The official inquiry into the desertion of the Islandmore Lighthouse was unable to reach any conclusion as to the fate of Thomas Marshall and his two companions. But the sailors on board the Fairwind couldn't put the ghastly sight of the lifeboat filled with living corpses out of their minds. The boat that was being rowed steadily towards the lighthouse by dead men. There was a local legend that said sometimes the ghosts of shipwrecked sailors came ashore to claim the living. The mystery of the Mary Celeste. On November 17, 1872, the merchant brigantine Mary Celeste left the port of New York. She was bound for Genoa, Italy, with a cargo of alcohol meant to be added to wine to fortify it. Benjamin Spooner Briggs was her captain, in charge of a crew of 7. Also on board were Captain Briggs' wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Sophia Matilda, just 2 years old. On December 4th, the crew of the De Gracia saw the Mary Celeste drifting in the Atlantic, 400 miles east of the Azores. She was full of cargo and carried 6 months' worth of food and water, but the ship's cat was the only living creature on board. Captain Briggs, his family, and 7 crew members were nowhere to be found. They were never heard from again. The Palatine Light. The ghostly ship, known as the Palatine, has appeared for nearly 300 years in the waters off the coast of Rhode Island. The eerie apparition has gained fame as the Palatine Light, and it usually manifests as a crimson glow on the horizon. The ship was probably a British vessel called the Princess Augusta. It left Rotterdam, Holland, in August 1738, carrying 240 passengers. Many of them were immigrants from the Palatine region of Germany, headed for a new life in Philadelphia. A few weeks into the voyage, the supplies of fresh water somehow got contaminated, causing an outbreak of fever and diarrhea on board. Captain George Long died, as did 7 crew members and more than half the passengers. First Mate Andrew Brooke took charge of the ship, and the immigrants' suffering began in earnest. The ship floundered around the Atlantic for an incredible 3 months after the contaminated water had started. Supplies of food and fresh water ran dangerously low. Brooke, now in charge, decided he could make a few bucks on the side by charging the passengers for the measly amount of food they were given. The ship ran into storm after storm in the winter months, which pushed it ever farther north. During Christmas week, the ship was caught in a vicious snowstorm somewhere in the Devil's Triangle, the region of the Rhode Island coast between Montauk Point, Block Island, and the mainland. The remaining crew just snapped. They plundered what they could from the ship, launched the ship's longboats, and abandoned the immigrants to their fate. The Princess Augusta, adrift without experienced sailors to man the tiller, tossed in the freezing waves until she beached herself on the rocky shore of Sandy Point on Block Island on December 27th. 20 more passengers died when the ship ran aground. The tragic event was immortalized in John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, The Palatine, written in 1867. In the poem, the Block Islanders who came down to the shore to investigate the wrecked ship are portrayed as heartless looters, no better than the crew who'd abandoned the ship in the first place. Finding nothing of value aboard the stricken ship, in the poem, the islanders simply set the ship on fire and pushed it back into the sea, passengers and all. Fortunately, this is not what actually happened. The story that Block Islanders prefer to tell is that they helped the 17 people left alive on the battered ship. The islanders took the immigrants to Simon Ray's farm, but the shipwreck and the privation of the previous weeks had taken their toll. Some of the immigrants regained their health, but most of them were beyond saving. As for the ship itself, it wasn't worth repairing, as it was still sitting wrecked on the rocky shore. The islanders feared that it would become a hazard to navigation, so they set fire to it. A freak wind lifted the burning ship into the swell of a wave, and it drifted back out to sea. The ship would claim one more victim as it left the shore forever. One woman was still below decks when the ship was fired. Half crazed from the terror of the voyage, she refused to leave the burning deck. The islanders watched in horror as the madwoman was burned alive, her shrieks echoing into the night. The ship is still seen even today. It manifests between Christmas and New Year's, usually on the anniversary of the fire. As reporter Edwin C. Hill wrote in 1934, there are people living on Block Island who will tell you, with their hand on the book, that they have gazed seaward in the blackness of night, startled by a bright radiance at sea, and have watched with straining eyes while the Palatine, blazing from trunk to keelson, swept along the horizon for many years. The abandoned woman's screams were said to accompany that queer crimson light on the darkening horizon, the light of the Palatine, forever burning, yet never consumed. All right, guys, that is it for today. We're going to continue next week. We don't know when this is ending. I think when we started, we were about halfway through on this book. So we're going to continue this. Let's see if I can figure out, like I had issues with it last week, trying to bookmark. Oh, I'll wait for that. Ah, there we go. I'm going to bookmark right there. Okay. See if I can bookmark. Okay, I'm not going to worry about it until I shut down. Anyway, thank you all for coming today. I will see you guys tomorrow. I'm off tonight. I'm going to be looking for more guests for the regular radio show, but I am off tonight as far as readings go. I will, however, be doing readings tomorrow night again at 7 p.m. Pacific over on TikTok, so you can join me over there for some free 3-card readings. But I thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening and your weekend. See you later, TikTok. Have a great one. And for you guys over here, same thing. I will see you. There's no show scheduled for tomorrow. You can join me over at TikTok at 7 p.m. Pacific tomorrow for some free tarot card readings. What I'll be working on tonight around 10 o'clock is I'm going to try and get some guests for starting next week, the week after tomorrow, the week from Monday, so we can get this consistently going, have guests every night, get the show back going on the air. I know it's been a long delay and sporadic shows, but I'm working, as you can tell. We've got the intros going. We're starting to get everything going like it used to be. So hopefully I can get some more shows lined up and get everything going consistently like it was. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. We'll continue this book next week. It's been great. I will see you. Oh, you know what I forgot to do, guys? You're going to have to sit tight for 1 second, okay? 1 second. 1 second. 1 second. Let me get something, because I forgot to load in. Hang on a second. Just bear with me. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing. I hope you can't. But I forgot to load in the that. I forgot to load in the credits, so here we go.